Hello. I'd like to start this lecture with a couple comments. First, I want to make sure that you all knew that I am neither a historian nor a theologian. My knowledge of Old Testament history is probably not much better than yours, and it's embedded in my mind as flannel graph cutouts from the 1960s from my Sunday school days. And let's face it, unless you're some professor of Old Testament history, these are not the two most exciting chapters in the Bible. So as a result, I decided that I needed to have a little fun with them. And I'll be upfront now by saying that my talk might not be 100% historically accurate. That being said, my primary goal is to show how these passages are a small part of God's great plan of redemptive history, and I pray to succeed to that end. Secondly, and I've never done this before, I'd like to dedicate this talk to our dear sister Mariah, who died very recently, but who was part of this Bible study for many years. We'll always remember her humor, her gentleness, and her wisdom. We are still sojourners in this foreign land, but Mariah is finally home. As I began to read these two chapters, I was a bit put off by the long inventories of temple objects and the long lists of names. Not a lot of material to work with, I thought, but with the aid of the handy commentaries, I began to read through these chapters and was surprised by how much depth and dimension I found. These were real people with names, or maybe nicknames, with meanings like dedicated to God and female scribe, but also humpback and talks too much. Many had names reflecting their Hebrew origins, others had adopted Babylonian names. Some of these people were leaders, some servants. I began to see them not as a list of funny-sounding names, but as a frozen moment in history, each name containing a story of its own and reflecting how they retained their identities despite their decades in exile. And one thing they had in common: even in their 70-year captivity, they might have put down roots and made new lives for their families, but their hearts remained in the land God had given their ancestors hundreds of years earlier. They had retained their identity as God's people, and they longed to return and rebuild their homeland. So when the new Persian King Cyrus proclaimed their freedom, it appears that as many as 50,000 people dropped everything and set their sights on Jerusalem. It must have been a wonderful time as the news spread, the joy becoming even greater with the realization that King Cyrus was even giving them back their sacred temple objects, bowls, plates, and other objects used in worship and sacrifice. Sadly, what was lost to the ages was the Ark of the Covenant, the symbolic presence of God among mankind. But a time of rebirth and renewal was at hand, and the people joyously gave freely out of their own purses in a capital campaign that would probably put us new lifers to shame. Now, being pre-recorded, I can't ask for a show of hands, but I wonder how many of you were part of our Bible study several years ago when we studied the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was one of those prophets who had warned the people over and over to give up their idol worship and turn back to the one true God, because their failure to do so would result in the destruction of their nation. But along with the warning, Isaiah foretold the events of Ezra and Nehemiah, actually mentioning King Cyrus by name. I remember this well because that was the passage, Isaiah 45, that I lectured on that year. I hope a few of you remember it too, because in my talk, I introduced you to a woman I called Hannah, my sister from another century. Hannah lived in Jerusalem in the year 586 BC when the Babylonians swept through the country one last time, destroying the temple and carrying off the remaining people into captivity. Like other people of her society, Hannah had not comprehended how offensive her practice of idol worship was to God, and how it had led to these horrific events. In my story, Hannah told us how she, with her son and husband, somehow managed to escape capture, but lived out their lives in poverty amidst the ruins of the late, great Jerusalem. But did you remember that Hannah also had a daughter? Since I told you how I felt there was a good story behind the names on that list in chapter 2, let's hear one. Today I would like you to meet Hannah's daughter and hear what she has to say in her own words. And may I add that any similarities to my own family may or may not be fully intentional. All right. My name is Judith. Perhaps you have heard of my mother, Hannah, and know of her story. I wish I knew what happened to her. I'm grieved to say that I never saw her again since we were all taken off into captivity. The last time we were all together, I was a young wife and mother, but many years have passed, and now I have quite a story of my own to tell. Yes, I'm very old now, but while my memory is still sharp, I want to make sure you hear and learn from my life. At the time of my birth in the land of Judah, things were already going downhill. I had heard stories of King David. He was the king who loved and served God, and of his son Solomon. He built our glorious temple. Those were the glory days when God's favor was on them. The temple was a reminder that he dwelled with us, his chosen people. But that was hundreds of years ago, and since then, the kings that followed them seemed to go from bad to worse, worshiping idols, living lives of sin, and leading the rest of us down the road to destruction. The prophets warned us, but we didn't listen. But finally the day came when their words were fulfilled, and the army of the Babylonians descended upon our country. They came in waves, the first time when I was a little girl. I remember that day. My brother had just been born, and my parents were terrified. They swept through Jerusalem, plundering the temple and carrying off the best and brightest young men to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Things did quiet down for a few years until I was a teenager, and they came back for more. Again, we managed to escape the marauders, and life settled down to an uneasy new normal. I grew into womanhood and got married and had my first son. Then came the year that changed everything. I'm sure you have gone through some bad years yourselves. Maybe you're going through one right now. But I don't think your bad year can hold a candle to mine. That was the year that we were invaded one last and terrible time. It was a night I wish I could forget. We were awakened in the night by shouting and wailing. Soldiers walked the streets, ordering us out of our houses. They weren't picky anymore. This time they took everyone they could find and killed anyone they thought wasn't worth the trouble. In the confusion, we lost track of my parents and brother. I looked desperately for them in the crowds and among the dead bodies in the streets, but to no avail, and as I said, we never saw them again. And like I said, that's their story. Let me continue with mine. As we began our long walk into captivity, I looked back towards Jerusalem, or what was left of it, seeing smoke curling up from the remains of the temple. That's when the thought hit me. We, God's chosen people, had abandoned him. Now, seeing his house in flames, I wondered, has God finally abandoned us? It was a hard journey, made even harder by the fact that we had no idea what awaited us at the end. You know, we Hebrews seem to travel a lot. I was taught the stories of how our father Abraham traveled from Ur to the Promised Land, and then how our people left Egypt to escape slavery and returned to this Promised Land. Yes, it wasn't always easy for them, but in their case, at least they knew they were going home. As we trudged along through the wilderness, it dawned on me that our journey into exile was more like that of our first parents, Adam and Eve. They too rebelled against God, and they were cast out of Eden, the first temple, the place where mankind was meant to dwell with God without sin or shame. Now history has repeated itself. We just don't seem to learn, do we? Well, let me continue. We arrived in Babylon filthy and exhausted, but safe and alive. And after a while, life there ended up being better than we had feared. We were able to live together in a Jewish sector and given work to do. My husband was already a skilled baker, so he had no problem going right to work, and we ended up living a pretty comfortable life. But always in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about home. Babylon was lavish with beauty and wealth, but it was not home. It was a bloated pagan metropolis, teeming with people from all over the empire, many of them captives like ourselves, and all of them bringing their own particular gods with them. Seeing those idols everywhere, grotesque copies of humans and animals, made from wood, stone, or metal, began to sicken me. I was ashamed that we had ever put our faith in these stupid, lifeless objects. But we managed to coexist fairly peacefully, and as the years passed, we lived lives as normal as one might expect in exile. We were blessed with a second son, and we made sure to raise our boys in the traditions of our people, teaching them everything we could about our history, the patriarchs, the judges, the kings, and what led to us living in this strange land. Most importantly, we taught them to despise idols and to worship the one true God, the Holy One, the Creator of the universe. We instilled in them the promises of Scripture, that God had a plan to bring us back to the promised land, teaching them the words of the prophet Jeremiah. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile." I'm sad to say that my good husband died before seeing these promises fulfilled, but not before seeing our boys grow into fine young men, marry nice Jewish girls, and bless us with many grandchildren. The years passed, and even as I grew elderly and frail, I never lost my dream of returning to my homeland, to Jerusalem, to a new temple where we could worship God without hindrance. I was becoming resigned to the thought that this would never happen in my lifetime, though, when another day came that changed everything again. We had heard rumors that the Persians were on the way, a new superpower that was planning to take Babylon out of the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. No love lost, in my opinion. However, all of us who remembered the invasions of our homeland began to relive the uneasy fear of an uncertain future as the new king, King Cyrus, established his rule over Babylon. So imagine our surprise and disbelief when we heard this proclamation. "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all of his people, may God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem." Well, I don't want to nitpick, but he might have exaggerated a bit, implying that he has such a direct line to God. Most of these idol worshippers can't see anything higher than the sky, so referring to the God of heaven is something they can all agree on. But the God we Hebrews worship, the only true God, is the one who created the sky. And I believe he is the one who works around, through, and in spite of human actions. He has bigger plans than putting a man on the throne or winning his wars. But in God's wisdom and providence, he has moved the heart of King Cyrus to send us home. We immediately began packing up, gathering food, and saying tearful goodbyes to our friends. Not everyone was ready for a 4-month trip. Perhaps God has not moved their hearts as he did mine, but I hope they'll join us. People worry that I'm too old for this, but I don't listen to them. My prayers have always been to see my homeland again, and God has heard me. The joy in my heart is so different from the shame and sorrow I felt as we left Jerusalem all those years ago. We were finally leaving exile and returning home. This was even better than when our ancestors left Egypt. They had Pharaoh's army at their heels. We were leaving with King Cyrus's blessing, plus he has given us back our precious gold and silver objects, bowls, plates, and the like. Can you believe they're safe and intact? Now we can use them for the reason they were made, to worship God in the new temple. There's not much to say about that trip. Let me just say I'm very thankful for the donkey they gave me to ride on, and I'm very glad it's over. I had not forgotten my last view of Jerusalem in smoke and ruins, but I was not prepared for the desolation and rubble that awaited us. I was also not prepared for the people's response, joyful generosity. Pockets opened and money flowed freely into the treasury to begin the work of restoration. I'm not sure how long this rebuilding will take, and I'm not sure if I will live to see it completed. But I rest content in the knowledge that my bones will lie in the ground of my forefathers, and that my family will reclaim their ancestral land. But most of all, I rest in the knowledge that, despite our unfaithfulness, God never forgot about us. All along, he has loved us, and all along, he has had a plan to bring us home. Let's stop Judith's story here, as she sees her life's longing fulfilled and is home at last. Can you think of your own moments of utter joy, peace, and contentment? Here's a few of mine. Bringing my son home after a long hospital stay just envelops me with a deep sense of warmth and comfort. Picking tomatoes with my grandsons makes me just feel purely and simply happy. Singing in church with my heart and voice lifted up in undistracted praise feels like a taste of heaven. To me, those moments, though fleeting, are glimpses of what my heart longs for. They are shadows of a perfect eternal joy, and our longing, our homesickness for them reminds us that we are meant for another world. In fact, they are evidence of its existence, for how can a longing and hunger exist without the means to satisfy it fully? We do try to find false gods to fill the void, food, pleasures, work, but it will only be in God's presence that our hearts will be completely satisfied. For now, we continue to live in exile, but we cling to the promise God has given us. And what of that plan to bring us out of our exile of sin and back to his presence? You might be holding it in your hands, because it is the Bible, Old and New Testaments, that teach us how God worked through history, through the centuries, for our salvation. All of the stories in it, even the most dry and obscure ones, are part of redemptive history, God's plan to bring us home. But we can also sum it up in one of the Bible's most familiar verses, John 3:16. For God so loved the world. God did not forget us. In fact, he continued to love us even when we rejected him. That he gave his one and only Son. He willingly exiled himself from the perfect joy of heaven to become human, to suffer and to die for our sins. That whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. This is his plan to bring us back to himself, to the new, eternal, perfect temple where we will finally experience fullness of joy. As I close, I can't help but wonder what Judith would say to encourage us in our own sojourns through this difficult year. In her culture, they might restart the calendar every time a new king came to power. So what would she think of the fact that we are living in 2020, 2020? No other king will ever come who is worthy of replacing the one who sits on the throne. Meditate on that fact and rejoice. Surely we have nothing to fear if he is on our side.